The Super Nintendo is my favorite console. Big surprise, right? So many good games from a variety of different developers. But since there were so many good games, some aren't acknowledged as much as others. So for this video, in no particular order, I will highlight some lesser mentioned games for you to try out in the future. These are 10 underrated Super Nintendo games. Now, you may see the name Tetris and think, how is this underrated? Tetris is pretty much the most popular video game puzzle series ever, except for maybe Minesweeper. Well, start a game and you quickly realize Tetris Attack isn't your typical Tetris game. Tetris Attack was released in 1994 and is an English translation / port of an original Japanese puzzle game named Panel de Pon, except with Yoshi Island branding all over it. As opposed to the 4-block shape clearing nature of the original Tetris, Tetris Attack instead focuses on 2 block shapes, except each block is marked with a different color that must be matched up with the same color in order to be cleared from the board. Blocks will steadily move upward, and it is up to the player to move the cursor and arrange the blocks before they reach the top of the screen. Once at least 4 of each block are lined up, the blocks will disappear and will cause blocks over it to fall as well. For such a simple concept, the gameplay is addicting, and Tetris Attack has multiple game modes that utilize the puzzle format in different ways, including a story mode, versus mode, and even a puzzle mode. The addition of the Yoshi's Island aesthetic only adds to the charm of the game, especially as the soundtrack is concerned. So maybe just ignore the game being called Tetris and enjoy what it has to offer. Underrated Disney show spawns underrated Capcom video game? How poetic. But it's true, the adventures of Goofy and his son Max are entertaining on both platforms. Goof Troop was released in 1993 by Capcom and is a top-down action-adventure game, similar in look to Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past. Instead of a sword though, Goofy and Max must use their environment to take out their enemies, solve puzzles, and make their way to the boss of each level in order to save PJ and Pete. Personally, I just let them go and go console Peg, but never mind, forget it. Single player is fun by itself, if not a little short, but the real enjoyable aspect of the game is the multiplayer, in which 2 people can play co-op throughout the entire game. Both people have their own inventory slot, which means cooperation is necessary to progress. It's another 90s Capcom license-based game that is better than it has any right to be, and a good time if you and a friend need a hidden gem to play. Now, silly title aside, if you haven't tried this game, I highly recommend you give it a shot, especially if you have a friend ready to spend hours along with you on the experience. Zombies Ate My Neighbors was released in 1993 by Lucasfilm and Konami for both the Super Nintendo and Genesis, and is 48 levels of madness. You control typical 90s stereotypical kid version 1 and 2 as they go through each level shooting zombies, ghouls, and other wild creatures while trying to save all of their neighbors in each level before leaving through a spawning door. At your disposal are all the weapons you can gather in these random locations, including a water gun, weed whacker, cross, and fucking bazooka. And from there, you just try not to die. You might think this game is a simple kiddie running gun, but it is deceptively hard. You are on the clock to save your neighbors, as if the zombies reach them first, they get murked. Now at first this might not seem so bad, as hunting after multiple neighbors can get tiring, but they don't respawn, meaning even if you go to the next level, the amount of neighbors remain the same, which can be real bad if you end up near the end with one neighbor, cause as soon as they get got, it's game over. Single player is fun enough, but 2 players can turn a chaotic experience even more hectic, and is worth the headache. Ever see yourself as a god? Okay, calm down there. Curtail those awful thoughts. Have you ever seen yourself as a god and instead of sending just blessings to your followers, you come down yourself just to beat the crap out of demons? That's the basic premise of Actraiser. Actraiser was released in 1990 by Quintet and Enix. You control literal God as he inhabits a statue and saves the world himself. You make your way across multiple levels, fighting various demons with a sword and the various magical attacks you gain on the way, till you make your way to some abomination as a boss. This is only half the game, however, which is why Actraiser is a quirky, underrated game for the Super Nintendo. In between the action levels, you control your growing populace and a top-down city simulator, where you help your people expand their towns by clearing land, watering crops, using your angel minion to shoot demons with arrows, you know, the usual stuff. This combination of two different gameplay styles are a unique blend that, oddly enough, isn't on enough people's lists of great Super Nintendo games. The Actraiser series in general is odd, with the sequel cutting out the city building entirely, and a remake coming 21 years later with the addition of a anime city building design and Sega Saturn action stage graphics, all mixed into one. You ever just see a box art for a game on a shelf and immediately think, who the hell is buying this? Well, as Phalanx has proven, you shouldn't always judge a book by its cover, cause ooh boy, who was super excited to play Equinox based on this? Yep, that sure is a cover alright, but I'm here to say if you haven't checked this game out based on this, you really missed out. Equinox was released in 1993 by Software Creations. It is a sequel to the game Solstice that was released on the NES in 1990 and retains the action-adventure isometric puzzle platforming gameplay. You control the character Glendale in search of his father, who was the main character in Solstice. You explore room after room in the generated level dungeons, solving puzzles, killing enemies, and gathering keys and all the spoils you can. The graphics and music are a considerable upgrade on the SNES hardware from Solstice, and the ramped up challenge through all 8 dungeons with increasing amount of rooms will give you all the interest that you could ever ask for. Check this one out. Hey, remember this series? Capcom sure doesn't. The last time we got a Breath of Fire game was a mobile scam in the mid-2010s, and before that was Dragon Quarter in 2005. The 4th game is probably the peak of the series, but the best on the Super Nintendo is Breath of Fire 2. Breath of Fire 2 was released in 1994 and is a turn-based RPG that doesn't stand out due to the twin towers of Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI. But people who are seeking a fun alternative should definitely look this way. While the first Breath of Fire was also great, it suffered from a clunky interface and poor translation between regions. While Breath of Fire 2 also has its own translation problems, with the names of moves and locations being butchered, it is a considerable upgrade from the first game. The combat is smooth, the moves are varied, and each character has an interesting story arc throughout the timeline, starting with 2 kids stealing from a church and ends with all the characters fighting God. You know, besides Gene. Gene sucks. Let's rev up our engines and go commit a war crime.
Hey yo, what the fuck?
Horizontal shooters were all too popular in the NES and Super Nintendo era, with Life Force and Gradius being among the most popular. But have you considered adding anime to the mix? UN Squadron was released in 1991 for the Super Nintendo and loads of gaming computers, and was developed as an arcade port by Capcom. You pick between 3 different pilots based off a Japanese manga series called Area 88, who each have their own different skill sets and planes, and fly through a variety of levels gunning down enemies and trying to keep your life bar up to keep your bird in the sky. For being one of the best horizontal shooters on the Super Nintendo, UN Squadron doesn't nearly get the props as much as I think it should. The gameplay is tight, the customization with the planes and special weapons you can purchase keep every level interesting, and in general aesthetic, sounds, and visuals of the game carry it to be one of the very best on the console. The Indiana Jones trilogy, is one of the most iconic 80s action films, and along with Star Wars, really highlighted how amazing main hero actor Harrison Ford is. While a lot of games based on the series aren't really worth thinking about longer than a couple hours, Indiana Jones' Greatest Adventures is one that you should definitely keep note of if you haven't already. Indiana Jones' Greatest Adventures was released in 1994 by Factor 5, JVC, and LucasArts. If you are familiar with the Star Wars games on Super Nintendo, this game is similar in scope of being faithful to the movies and being a really fun platforming game. So why did I choose to include this instead of those games? Easy. Those games are separated by movie, and this is all in one cartridge. I might be joking, maybe just a little bit. Seriously though, this game adapts the plot of all 3 movies into really imaginative levels. Whether you control Indy jumping through caverns whipping enemies, flying a plane, going down in a raft, or swinging across pits avoiding your doom. This game is a little more on the easy side than the Star Wars games since there are 28 levels you need to get across, but it doesn't diminish that this game is worth picking up if you have the chance. The Super Nintendo was a silent haven for beat-em-up games. Arcades had load of iconic beat-em-ups like The Simpsons, TMNT, Final Fight, and others. Ports to home consoles in the 16-bit era weren't always perfect, but most on the Super Nintendo retained most of their arcade charm. Sonic Blast Man, in contrast, retains very little from his arcade version, as the arcade version required players to put on gloves and literally falcon punch a punching bag to defeat enemies. The port to the Super Nintendo rightfully dropped that element and made it a beat-em-up, which was fun, but immediately outclassed by its eventual sequel. Sonic Blast Man 2 was released in 1994 by Taito and improves on the first beat-em-up in almost every way. First and foremost, you have multiple characters to choose from this time, as opposed to the first game, and also opposed from the first game, multiplayer is included. All of the levels are varied with different artwork, and the fighting is tight and enjoyable. Yeah, it can get a little mind-numbingly spammy at times, but when else are you gonna be able to punch the floor in a game and make everything explode?
I'm fighting for freedom.
So awesome. Since Nintendo is based in Japan, some games don't make the transition overseas to us in the Americas. In particular, there are some series that are infinitely more popular over there that don't correlate here and vice versa. For example, the Goemon franchise is super popular in Japan, and at the start, the games weren't even released in the West. That changed when Ganbare Goemon Yukihime Yukishutsu Umaki was released over here as The Legend of the Mystical Ninja. The Legend of the Mystical Ninja was released in 1991 and was made by Konami. You control Goemon or Ibisumaru if you're playing 2-player mode as they make their way through towns, buying equipment, earning money, talking to villagers, playing mini games, and generally preparing themselves for the second part of the level, which is a typical platforming beat-em-up with a boss at the end. The game has a lighthearted charm to it, with the characters being entertaining and the plot going out of left field on more than one occasion. The sprite work is honestly impressive, and the soundtrack complements the Japanese tones nicely, all adding up to a superb gaming experience. The Legend of the Mystical Ninja did not sell well in the West, which is a travesty as this game more than lives up to any possible expectations consumers may have had. Have any other games that I may have missed? Leave them in the comments below. Thank you, and have a good one.